The smell of burnt propellant remained inside Commander Eulo Romulus's memory long after the engagement had ended. Not the sharp chemical odor common to artillery ranges or garrison exercises, but the heavier mixture of overheated steel, leaking engine oil, human sweat, and scorched flesh that accumulated inside armored vehicles during prolonged combat. He would later describe the experience as mechanical suffocation. The Baneblade had not merely been a war engine during the defense of Hive Belis Corona's outer transit gate. It had become a sealed furnace, carrying 8 exhausted personnel through nearly 19 continuous hours of attritional warfare. Eulo Romulus recalled that the silence afterward disturbed him more than the battle itself. The constant roar of the main cannon, the screaming impacts against hull plating, the vibration of orc explosives against the tracks, and the endless shouting through vox systems had conditioned the crew into accepting noise as normality. When the sounds finally stopped, several members of the surviving defense force reportedly continued speaking at combat volume without realizing it. Eulo himself could no longer properly hear from his left ear during the first stages of medical debriefing. The commander had been born within the lower industrial sectors of Hive Belis Corona during millennia 41, year 876. His recorded age during the engagement stood at 36 standard Terran years. Administratum archives identified him as approximately 186 centimeters in height and weighing close to 94 kilograms prior to deployment. Years of armored service had broadened his shoulders and thickened his posture into the rigid stance common among Baneblade officers. His hair had prematurely grayed around the temples due to prolonged exposure to combat stimulants and inadequate sleep rotations during earlier campaigns against separatist rebellions along nearby Militarum districts. Romulus possessed a narrow facial structure marked by burn scarring beneath the jawline, sustained years earlier when a fuel ignition incident destroyed a Chimera transport during urban combat exercises. His left eyebrow never fully regrew following that incident. Guardsmen under his authority commonly described him as controlled, methodical, and emotionally restrained. He rarely shouted. Crew discipline was instead maintained through consistency and operational precision. Tank officers attached to super heavy formations often developed reputations for arrogance due to the destructive authority granted to Baneblade commanders. Romulus differed in this regard. Surviving reports repeatedly noted his preference for caution and calculated positioning over aggressive armored thrusts. At the time of the operation, Romulus served under the 109th Belis Armored Regiment, attached temporarily to the Outer Defense Command of Hive Belis Corona. The Hive itself represented one of the principal industrial centers upon the planet of Karthax Tertius, a polluted world dominated by chemical manufactorums, cargo rail systems, refinery districts, and densely populated labor sectors. The Hive population exceeded approximately 900 million registered citizens, excluding undocumented lower Hive populations and transient labor forces. The Outer Gate district assigned to Romulus's formation had originally functioned as a reinforced cargo transfer route connecting bulk ore convoys from southern extraction zones into the Hive interior. Massive adamantium blast doors protected the route. Defensive walls nearly 60 meters high surrounded the entrance corridors, supported by layered macro turrets, anti-infantry bunkers, and elevated firing positions for Imperial Guard infantry formations. Prior Orc sabotage during earlier engagements had critically damaged the primary gate mechanisms several days before Romulus arrived. Repairs remained incomplete. One side of the gate could no longer seal entirely, leaving an opening large enough for infantry and light vehicles to penetrate. Intelligence estimates projected that Snakebites clan forces would exploit the breach within less than 48 hours. Romulus received the assignment 3 days prior to the main engagement. Initial expectations from command considered the deployment temporary. Engineers believed repairs could be completed before major contact occurred. Those estimates later proved catastrophically inaccurate due to escalating Orc pressure across the outer districts. The Baneblade, under Romulus's command, carried the battlefield designation Invictus Ferrum. The vehicle itself had served for nearly 120 years within the Belis armored divisions. Machine records maintained by attached Mechanicus personnel identified the super heavy tank as a Mars pattern Baneblade constructed within the forge facilities of Graia subsector. Multiple repairs and battlefield reconstructions had altered substantial portions of the original hull over decades of service. The left track assembly contained replacement components originating from at least 4 separate armored vehicles destroyed during previous campaigns. Romulus maintained a strong attachment toward the machine despite outward professionalism. Baneblade crews frequently developed ritualistic respect toward their vehicles due to the immense responsibility associated with operating them. The Invictus Ferrum required constant maintenance, calibration, and machine appeasement rites, merely to remain operational. Crew members reportedly spent more time maintaining the vehicle than resting. The commander later stated during transcript review that the tank possessed behavioral irregularities familiar only to long-term crew members. Certain engine vibrations indicated track imbalance before warning runes appeared. Particular recoil patterns suggested when the primary cannon stabilizers required recalibration. The vehicle's internal temperature fluctuations revealed stress within the coolant circulation systems, long before full malfunction occurred. Romulus trusted the Baneblade more consistently than most infantry commanders attached to the outer wall defenses. He first observed the Snakebites' war formations through magnocular systems shortly before dusk, during preliminary deployment rotations. The Orc advance appeared less organized than prior encounters against mechanized clans. No massive armored spearheads led the assault. Instead, enormous columns of infantry and crude transport beasts advanced through ash plains and ruined industrial trenches beyond the gate approaches. The Snakebites differed substantially from more technologically inclined Orc clans. Intelligence officers classified them as primitive by Orc standards, though Romulus later warned against underestimating them. Their forces relied heavily upon brutal close-range assaults, improvised beast-mounted cavalry, scavenged artillery, and overwhelming numerical pressure. Large numbers wore crude hides, bone trophies, or ritualistic markings across exposed green flesh. Despite their appearance, they demonstrated alarming persistence during siege conditions. The commander specifically recalled observing hundreds of fires across distant plains during the night before full contact. Orc encampments stretched beyond visual range. Smoke columns rose continuously into the polluted atmosphere surrounding the Hive outskirts. Imperial artillery attempted intermittent bombardment throughout the night, though limited ammunition reserves prevented sustained shelling operations. Inside the Invictus Ferrum, operational preparations continued under controlled routine. Ammunition inventories were reviewed repeatedly. Fuel reserves were measured. Secondary weapon systems underwent final machine blessings from attached Mechanicus personnel. Crew members slept in short rotations beside ammunition racks and engine housings, while the tank remained stationary beneath defensive wall cover. Romulus himself reportedly slept less than 2 hours during the final night before engagement. By dawn, the first distant impacts against outer trench lines became audible through the Baneblade's armored hull. The defense of Hive Belis Corona had begun long before the crew realized they would not survive it unchanged. The Invictus Ferrum operated with a crew smaller than standard super heavy deployment doctrine, recommended for prolonged siege engagements. Multiple casualties suffered during earlier armored operations across the southern refinery. Districts had reduced available personnel throughout the 109th Belis Armored Regiment. Replacement crewmen remained scarce due to mounting losses among reserve formations. Commander Eulo Romulus therefore retained only those personnel considered absolutely essential to maintaining operational effectiveness. Despite the reduced manpower, internal efficiency aboard the Baneblade remained unusually high. Most members of the crew had served together for more than 3 standard years. Their familiarity with one another compensated for shortages that would normally cripple less experienced armored teams. Tactical Officer Bron Guile functioned as the vehicle's secondary command authority. At 41 standard Terran years of age, Guile represented the oldest member of the crew, excluding the attached Adeptus Mechanicus representative. Records identified him as originating from the upper Manufactorum districts of Hive Belis Corona. Prior to military service, he had worked within cargo routing administration, overseeing rail distribution schedules for ore processing plants. The experience had shaped his operational mindset. Guile approached warfare through logistics and positional analysis rather than aggression. He maintained constant awareness of ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, casualty rates, wall integrity reports, and neighboring unit status. Romulus often relied upon him during extended engagements, where battlefield awareness became fragmented due to communication overload. Physically, Guile possessed a lean frame with thinning dark hair and extensive augmetic replacements along his right hand following industrial machinery accidents during adolescence. His speech remained consistently calm even during combat conditions. Several guardsmen stationed alongside the Baneblade later remarked that hearing Guile speak through Vox channels during heavy fighting produced a stabilizing effect on nearby infantry morale. Driver Davon Fritz represented the youngest member of the crew at 24 years of age. Unlike most armored personnel recruited from Hive populations, Fritz originated from agricultural settlements outside the primary Hive territories. His early life, operating heavy ore haulers across unstable wasteland roads, translated effectively into armored vehicle control. Romulus had personally requested Fritz's assignment after observing him maneuver damaged Lehman Russ tanks through collapsing refinery corridors during earlier campaigns. Fritz stood approximately 190 centimeters tall, with broad shoulders and unusually pale skin resulting from limited hive exposure during childhood. Crew members frequently described him as quiet and intensely focused while operating the Baneblade. During inactive periods, he rarely participated in conversation, preferring instead to inspect track assemblies or assist maintenance crews. His driving style prioritized preservation of mechanical integrity over speed. This characteristic occasionally frustrated infantry officers, demanding rapid repositioning, though Romulus considered it essential for long-term survivability. The Adeptus Mechanicus attachment, assigned to the Invictus Ferrum, identified herself only as Scylla. Whether this represented her original name remained unclear. Mechanicus records frequently omitted personal identifiers following extensive cybernetic modification. Scylla's estimated biological age exceeded 60 standard years, though augmetic reconstruction rendered precise assessment difficult. Large sections of her body had been replaced through Mechanicus enhancement procedures. Her lower jaw consisted almost entirely of metallic vocalization components. Mechanical optic replacements glowed dim red beneath hooded robes stained with sacred oils and chemical residue. Additional manipulator limbs extended from reinforced spinal harnesses mounted across her back, allowing simultaneous repair operations inside cramped machinery compartments. Crew members maintained respectful distance from Scylla during inactive periods. Although cooperative toward operational necessities, she displayed minimal interest in ordinary human interaction. Her primary loyalty remained directed toward the machine spirit of the Invictus Ferrum rather than its crew. Romulus nonetheless trusted her technical expertise completely. Several times during previous deployments, she had restored damaged systems considered irreparable by conventional engineering standards. Primary Gunner Jord Geffer and Secondary Gunner James Geffer were biological brothers recruited from the same under-Hive militia formations nearly 12 years earlier. Jord, the elder sibling by approximately 4 years, controlled the Baneblade's primary cannon systems. James supervised secondary sponson weapon operations along the starboard side of the vehicle. The brothers shared similar physical characteristics, including dark hair, broad facial structures, and extensive tattoo markings originating from local gang territories prior to Imperial Guard conscription. Despite similar appearances, their personalities differed significantly. Jord remained disciplined and serious during operations, rarely engaging in unnecessary speech once combat began. James displayed greater aggression and humor, frequently mocking enemy forces even during dangerous engagements. Romulus tolerated James's behavior because his combat performance consistently exceeded expectations. Secondary weapon crews often suffered severe psychological fatigue during prolonged close-range fighting due to constant exposure to infantry assaults against armored hulls. James instead appeared to thrive under such pressure. Infantry survivors later recalled hearing him laughing through external Vox speakers while firing heavy bolter emplacements into advancing Orc formations. Tertiary Gunner Loyd Floss controlled dorsal weapon systems and assisted secondary defensive fire coverage. Floss possessed prior experience aboard anti-aircraft platforms defending orbital cargo elevators before transfer into armored service. He carried extensive burn scarring across both forearms following ammunition detonations sustained during a separatist air raid several years earlier. Unlike several other crew members, Floss maintained open religious devotion toward the Imperial cult. Small purity seals lined portions of his internal firing station. Prior to combat deployments, he routinely recited battlefield prayers while checking weapon calibrations. Other crew members generally ignored the ritual's provided operational duties, remained unaffected. Tertiary Loader Malcolm Trias performed the physically exhausting responsibility of assisting ammunition transfer operations throughout the Baneblade interior. Baneblade shells weighed enormous amounts, even with mechanical assistance systems installed. During sustained engagements, loaders frequently collapsed from exhaustion before battles concluded. Trias represented one of the few surviving members from the Invictus Ferrum's original support personnel, assigned nearly 6 years earlier. Age and repeated combat injuries had slowed him noticeably by the time of the Hive Gate deployment. Medical records documented spinal deterioration, fractured ribs healed improperly, and partial hearing loss. Nonetheless, he refused reassignment repeatedly, despite administrative recommendations. Romulus later admitted that Trias should probably have been removed from active service months before the siege began. However, replacing experienced loaders during wartime proved nearly impossible. Logistical support surrounding the outer gate defenses deteriorated steadily during the days preceding major contact. Militarum supply routes suffered repeated Orc ambushes along southern transit corridors. Fuel deliveries arrived inconsistently. Artillery ammunition rationing became increasingly severe. Several infantry formations defending adjacent sectors reportedly operated below 60% combat strength. The Invictus Ferrum itself received priority status regarding ammunition allocation due to its strategic significance. Even so, reserves remained insufficient for unrestricted operations. Primary cannon shells were carefully rationed according to projected engagement necessity. High explosive rounds remained plentiful compared to armor-piercing ammunition, reflecting expectations that Orc infantry assaults would dominate the coming battle. Food distribution throughout the defensive sectors declined sharply during final preparations. Guardsmen stationed atop the gate walls survived primarily upon nutrient bars, recycled water, and stimulant injections intended to suppress exhaustion. Sleep rotations rarely exceeded 90 minutes consecutively due to constant bombardment alerts beyond the perimeter. Weather conditions further complicated defensive readiness. Karthax Tertius possessed an atmosphere heavily polluted by centuries of industrial output. Ash storms frequently swept across the outer plains surrounding Hive Belis Corona, reducing visibility and contaminating exposed machinery. During the 48 hours preceding engagement, thick particulate clouds coated defensive emplacements in fine black residue. Maintenance crews worked continuously, clearing weapon mechanisms before systems seized entirely. The mission briefing occurred approximately 6 hours before initial Orc contact. Senior command representatives assembled armored officers, infantry commanders, and artillery coordinators within a reinforced bunker, positioned beneath the western wall sectors overlooking the damaged gate corridor. Hololithic displays projected terrain maps alongside estimated Orc movement patterns. Vox operators relayed fragmented intelligence updates from reconnaissance patrols collapsing beyond the defensive perimeter. Romulus remembered the atmosphere inside the command bunker as controlled resignation rather than confidence. Strategic Command no longer believed the gate could be permanently held. The objective instead focused upon delaying Orc penetration long enough for inner Hive defense lines to fully mobilize civilian evacuation routes and establish secondary kill zones deeper within the city approaches. The Invictus Ferrum received orders to position directly before the malfunctioning gate breach itself. The Baneblade would serve as a mobile fortress, sealing the damaged opening, while infantry regiments and wall turrets delivered supporting fire overhead. Engineers estimated repairs required at minimum 18 additional hours, assuming uninterrupted labor operations. Romulus privately considered the estimate unrealistic the moment he heard it. Should the outer defense fail, fallback routes toward the second Hive wall would remain temporarily accessible through eastern maintenance corridors. However, Strategic Command openly acknowledged those routes might collapse under sufficient Orc pressure. The meeting concluded without ceremonial speeches or motivational declarations. Every officer present already understood the scale of the approaching assault. As the crew returned toward the Invictus Ferrum through smoke-covered transit trenches beneath the Hive walls, distant thunder echoed beyond the ash plains outside the city perimeter. Initially, several guardsmen assumed incoming storms approached across the wastelands. Bron Guile reportedly corrected them first. The sound was not weather. It was the Snakebites' war drums beginning their advance. The deployment toward the outer gate sectors began before sunrise, under near-zero visibility conditions caused by industrial ash storms sweeping across the southern plains of Karthax Tertius. The Invictus Ferrum departed from its temporary staging position beneath the interior maintenance vaults of Hive Belis Corona, accompanied by 2 Chimera transports carrying additional ammunition crews and approximately 60 guardsmen from the 72nd Belis Line Regiment. Commander Eulo Romulus remained inside the forward command compartment throughout the movement, observing external terrain through restricted optic feeds mounted above the Baneblade's frontal armor. Even before reaching the outer walls, signs of the ongoing Orc advance had become visible across the surrounding districts. Entire industrial zones beyond the southern approach roads had already been abandoned. Cargo cranes stood motionless against the polluted horizon. Burned civilian transports littered transit lanes beside overturned ore haulers and partially collapsed checkpoint stations. Several outer hab blocks continued smoldering from artillery strikes conducted during earlier withdrawal operations. The Hive authorities had ordered complete evacuation of all populations living beyond the second defense perimeter nearly 4 days earlier, though scattered civilian bodies remained visible along drainage canals and roadway intersections, where evacuation convoys had apparently failed to escape in time. Romulus observed most of these scenes silently. The crew had witnessed destroyed settlements before. Yet the scale surrounding Hive Belis Corona differed from previous campaigns. This was not an isolated battlefield or frontier skirmish. Nearly an entire urban hemisphere now prepared for siege conditions. Inside the Baneblade, internal temperatures steadily climbed despite inactive weapon systems. 8 personnel operating within the armored hull generated immense heat alongside the engine systems themselves. ventilation units struggled continuously against the polluted external atmosphere. Metallic surfaces inside the crew compartments remained slick with condensation mixed alongside oil residue and chemical lubricant runoff. Bron Guile spent much of the journey monitoring incoming Vox traffic from surrounding defensive sectors. Reports arriving through command frequencies painted an increasingly unstable operational picture. Multiple infantry pickets positioned beyond the southern trench networks had ceased transmission entirely during the previous night. Long-range Auspex systems detected large moving formations approaching through the ash fields, though visual confirmation remained difficult due to environmental interference. Guile eventually transmitted a summarized estimate toward Romulus through the internal Vox system. Projected contact now within 6 hours, possibly less if they maintain current movement speed. Romulus acknowledged without removing his attention from the forward optics. The Baneblade continued advancing. Driver Davon Fritz maneuvered the massive vehicle carefully through damaged industrial transit roads, partially obstructed by rubble and abandoned military equipment. Despite the Baneblade's immense size, road stability remained a serious concern throughout sections of the outer Hive approaches. Earlier artillery impacts had fractured several elevated transit routes, forcing armored units onto unstable maintenance corridors originally intended for cargo lifters and utility vehicles. The Invictus Ferrum crossed one such collapsed roadway approximately 90 minutes into deployment. Fritz reduced speed significantly, while the tank's suspension systems groaned beneath shifting weight distribution. Crew members reportedly felt the entire Baneblade tilt several degrees sideways as the left track assembly rolled across fractured concrete slabs suspended above a drainage trench nearly 20 meters deep. Malcolm Trias later described hearing portions of the roadway collapsing behind the tank once they completed the crossing. No one inside the vehicle commented on it. The closer the crew moved toward the outer walls, the more concentrated military activity became. Thousands of guardsmen occupied trenches, elevated firing platforms, bunker systems, and transit tunnels surrounding the damaged gate district. Heavy weapon teams hauled ammunition crates across reinforced walkways, while engineering personnel attempted last-minute fortification repairs beneath continuous time pressure. Romulus specifically recalled the exhaustion visible among frontline infantry formations. Most had already endured multiple days of continuous preparation without proper rest. Uniforms appeared coated in black industrial dust. Respirator filters hung partially damaged from repeated usage. Several medical evacuation teams transported wounded personnel toward interior triage stations even before the main assault had begun. Casualties originating from artillery bombardments and Orc reconnaissance attacks beyond the perimeter. As the Invictus Ferrum approached the gate district itself, surrounding infantry formations visibly reacted to the Baneblade's arrival. Guardsmen paused briefly from defensive preparations to watch the super-heavy tank advance through the smoke-covered avenues beneath the Hive walls. Some raised weapons or saluted toward the armored vehicle. Others simply stared silently. Super-heavy tanks remained rare sights even within major Hive defense armies. Their presence carried psychological significance beyond battlefield utility. To exhausted frontline personnel, the arrival of a Baneblade implied that Imperial command still considered the sector defensible. Romulus understood this perception, and deliberately ordered reduced movement speed during the final approach. The damaged outer gate came into full view shortly afterward. The structure dominated the surrounding district with overwhelming scale. Twin adamantium blast doors rose nearly 50 meters above the defensive corridor, embedded directly into the massive outer hive walls. One side remained partially sealed, while the opposing gate had suffered catastrophic mechanical damage from earlier Orc sabotage operations. Huge fractures split the metal surface near the lower locking assemblies. Emergency welds and reinforcement braces covered portions of the breach, though none restored full functionality. The remaining opening measured approximately 11 meters across at its widest point, large enough for Orc infantry penetration, large enough for disaster. The Baneblade's assigned defensive position stood directly before the breach itself, atop a reinforced firing platform constructed from ferrocrete and steel support beams. Defensive trenches surrounded the area alongside anti-infantry barricades, razor wire networks, and overlapping heavy bolter emplacements positioned across elevated firing galleries above the corridor. Wall-mounted turrets lined both sides of the gate approach. Massive autocannon batteries rotated slowly overhead, while searchlights swept intermittently across the ash plains beyond the perimeter. Hundreds of guardsmen occupied firing positions along the upper wall sectors, stretching far into the distance on both sides of the gate complex. Yet, despite the extensive defenses, Romulus immediately identified the central weakness of the position. The entire line depended upon maintaining control of the breach. If the Orc horde penetrated the opening in sufficient numbers, the confined corridor would become impossible to contain. Scylla departed the Baneblade almost immediately following arrival. Accompanied by several maintenance servitors, the Adeptus Mechanicus representative began conducting machine rites across the exterior hull, while simultaneously inspecting damage sustained during transit. Sacred oils coated portions of the engine housing as incense smoke drifted upward into the polluted atmosphere. Binary prayers echoed faintly from her vocal implants, while servo limbs adjusted ammunition feed calibrations beneath the main cannon housing. The remaining crew focused on combat readiness procedures. Jord Geffer supervised loading sequences for the primary cannon, while James and Loyd Floss checked secondary weapon systems covering both flanks of the Baneblade. Malcolm Trias organized ammunition reserves throughout the internal storage compartments, carefully separating high explosive shells from anti-armor payloads according to projected combat priorities. Davon Fritz remained beneath the vehicle, inspecting track tension assemblies personally, despite worsening environmental conditions. Romulus eventually climbed onto the upper hull beside Bron Guile to survey the surrounding terrain beyond the walls. Visibility remained poor due to the continuing ash storms, though distant movement occasionally became visible across the wasteland plains through magnocular enhancement systems. At first, the shapes appeared indistinct beneath the haze. Then the scale became clearer. The Snakebites were already assembling. Massive columns of Orc infantry stretched across the southern approaches beyond visual range. Crude banners swayed above enormous moving crowds, illuminated intermittently by burning fuel pits and artillery flashes. Large beast-mounted formations moved alongside scavenged armored vehicles constructed from mismatched scrap plating and exposed engine components. Even at extreme distance, the noise reached the walls. war drums, metal impacts, animal roars, thousands upon thousands of guttural voices merging together beneath the polluted sky. Bron Guile quietly estimated the visible horde at no less than several 100,000 advancing infantry. Romulus did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched engineering crews below continue welding damaged sections of the gate, while guardsmen hauled fresh ammunition toward the upper wall emplacements. The work continued because it had to continue. Fear no longer mattered at that stage of deployment. Several hours later, as darkness began settling across the outer plains, the first Orc artillery impacts struck the distant trench lines beyond the gate approaches. The siege of Hive Belis Corona had officially entered its opening phase. The outer defense corridor surrounding the damaged gate of Hive Belis Corona had originally been engineered for industrial traffic management rather than sustained military operations. Commander Eulo Romulus recognized this immediately during the first hours of siege deployment. The structure possessed impressive scale and heavy reinforcement, but its design favored cargo throughput efficiency over layered battlefield survivability. Once converted into a defensive choke point, numerous structural vulnerabilities became apparent beneath prolonged combat conditions. From the Baneblade's elevated command optics, the terrain beyond the hive walls extended outward into a wasteland of industrial devastation. Decades of chemical dumping and mining activity had transformed the southern plains of Karthax Tertius into barren ash fields broken by rusted refinery skeletons, collapsed transport rails, and drainage channels carrying polluted runoff toward distant processing oceans. Little natural vegetation remained. The few surviving plant forms resembled blackened thorn growths protruding through toxic dust beds around abandoned machinery. Visibility across the plains fluctuated constantly due to atmospheric instability. Ash storms rolled unpredictably through the region, sometimes reducing sightlines below 100 meters before clearing again without warning. Fine particulate matter coated armor plating, clogged weapon housings, and contaminated exposed respirator systems within minutes. Guardsmen, as stationed atop the walls, wrapped additional cloth around ventilation masks to delay filter failure, though most replacements had already been exhausted before full engagement began. The weather itself favored neither side entirely, but Romulus understood quickly that the Snakebites adapted to the conditions more effectively than Imperial command had anticipated. The Orc formations did not rely heavily upon advanced optics or precise artillery coordination. Their assaults emphasized mass movement, momentum, and close-range brutality. Limited visibility, therefore, hindered Imperial long-range targeting far more significantly than it disrupted Orc advance patterns. The gate corridor itself formed the most strategically significant position across the entire southern defensive district. The damaged opening measured approximately 11 meters across near the lower breach point, narrowing further inward due to collapsed reinforcement plating and emergency barricade construction. This forced any large-scale assault into a confined funnel between the massive outer walls. Imperial planners intended to exploit the bottleneck by concentrating overlapping fields of fire directly into the approach corridor. In theory, the strategy possessed merit. In practice, it depended entirely upon maintaining uninterrupted ammunition supply and disciplined defensive cohesion under extreme pressure. The Baneblade Invictus Ferrum occupied the center of the defensive structure directly before the breach itself. The positioning transformed the super heavy tank into both shield and artillery platform simultaneously. Its enormous armored hull physically obstructed much of the remaining gate opening, while allowing the primary cannon and secondary weapon systems to dominate the surrounding approaches. Romulus initially approved of the placement. The Baneblade's frontal armor could withstand punishment that would annihilate ordinary armored vehicles. Any Orc force attempting direct penetration through the breach would need to advance beneath concentrated fire from the tank, elevated wall emplacements, and supporting infantry trenches simultaneously. Yet the position carried severe disadvantages as well. Retreat options remained extremely limited. If the Invictus Ferrum became immobilized inside the breach corridor, the vehicle would effectively become a stationary fortress unable to reposition while enemy forces surrounded it. Romulus privately acknowledged this possibility during early deployment preparations, but withheld the concern from most crew members. Super heavy tank doctrine frequently demanded static sacrifice during siege warfare. The crew already understood the implications without needing verbal confirmation. Above the Baneblade, the outer hive walls extended approximately 60 meters upward into heavily reinforced battlements lined with layered defensive systems. Heavy bolter nests occupied recessed firing galleries every 40 meters along the corridor. Twin-linked autocannon turrets rotated continuously from armored housings embedded deeper within the wall structure. Searchlight arrays scanned the ash fields beyond the perimeter throughout the night, while artillery spotters coordinated distant bombardments through elevated observation bunkers. Thousands of guardsmen occupied these upper levels. Romulus estimated at least 4 full infantry regiments distributed across the surrounding wall sectors during the opening deployment stages. Most belonged to local Belis defense forces accustomed to urban warfare and static defensive operations. Equipment quality varied substantially between units. Some formations wore relatively modern flak armor with functional optics and standardized las rifles. Others carried visibly outdated equipment repaired repeatedly through battlefield necessity. Despite exhaustion and deteriorating supply conditions, overall morale remained stable during the early stages of deployment. The presence of the Baneblade contributed heavily toward this. Throughout the first night, infantry personnel rotated repeatedly near the Invictus Ferrum under various logistical pretexts, simply to observe the super heavy tank more closely. Some guardsmen touched the armored hull while passing by. Others quietly recited battlefield prayers beneath the massive tracks before returning toward their firing stations. Romulus noticed the behavior through exterior optics, but chose not to interfere. Fear spread differently among infantry formations when heavy armor stood beside them. Directly beneath the wall platforms, interconnected trench systems formed secondary defensive layers surrounding the gate corridor. Razor wire networks, anti-infantry mines, portable barricades, and overlapping sandbag fortifications created dense kill zones leading toward the breach itself. Several heavy stubber teams occupied concealed bunkers positioned to fire directly along the lower approaches, should Orc infantry reach the wall base. Additional reserve positions existed deeper within the hive entrance beyond the Baneblade. These fallback lines consisted primarily of retractable barricades and demolitions prepared by engineering corps units, in case the outer corridor collapsed entirely. Romulus observed these preparations during initial inspections and immediately recognized their significance. Command had already planned for the possibility of failure. The Snakebites began probing the defenses gradually, rather than launching immediate full-scale assaults. During the first operational day, scattered Orc reconnaissance groups advanced intermittently through the ash storms, testing Imperial firing ranges and turret response patterns. Most were destroyed long before reaching the walls. Nonetheless, their presence revealed important information regarding enemy movement routes and terrain usage. Bron Guile spent considerable time analyzing these patterns through tactical overlays projected inside the Baneblade command compartment. The Orc advance exploited the industrial ruins scattered across the southern plains with surprising efficiency. Burned refinery structures, collapsed rail systems, abandoned cargo haulers, and drainage trenches all provided intermittent concealment, allowing advancing infantry to approach closer than expected before detection. Guile eventually identified 3 principal assault corridors likely to support the main attack. The western flank contained extensive refinery wreckage capable of masking large infantry concentrations. The central approach led directly toward the breach corridor itself across open ash plains, littered with destroyed vehicles. The eastern sectors contained deep chemical drainage channels, providing covered movement routes toward the wall foundations. Romulus adjusted firing priorities accordingly. Jord Geffer calibrated the Baneblade's primary cannon toward the central approaches, while secondary gun crews prepared overlapping coverage against eastern and western assault vectors. Wall artillery commanders synchronized targeting coordinates with the Baneblade through continuous Vox updates. Scylla, meanwhile, focused almost entirely upon preserving machine functionality against environmental degradation. The ash storms proved exceptionally dangerous for armored systems during prolonged static operations. Fine particulate matter infiltrated ventilation housings, ammunition feed mechanisms, and engine cooling assemblies, despite repeated maintenance efforts. Scylla deployed servitors constantly across the hull, conducting purification rites and emergency cleaning procedures beneath worsening conditions. At one stage during the second deployment night, she reportedly informed Romulus that the machine spirit of the Invictus Ferrum displayed rising agitation due to atmospheric contamination and sustained operational strain. Romulus interpreted this practically rather than spiritually. The Baneblade was beginning to wear down before the main assault had even started. Still, the strategic advantages of the position remained substantial. The confined terrain prevented large Orc vehicles from effectively maneuvering near the breach. Elevated wall positions granted Imperial defenders dominant firing angles across most approach routes. The Baneblade's presence transformed the damaged opening into an armored bastion, difficult to overwhelm quickly. For several hours, portions of the defense force even believed the position might genuinely hold. Then the Orc artillery intensified. The first major bombardment began shortly after local midnight during the second operational night. Crude but massive shells launched from distant Orc siege guns screamed across the polluted sky before impacting throughout the outer defense sectors. Entire sections of trench lines disappeared beneath explosions of ash and ferrocrete fragments. One elevated autocannon platform collapsed entirely after sustaining direct hits, sending burning debris and surviving guardsmen falling toward the lower barricades below. The Baneblade itself absorbed multiple nearby impacts that shook the entire hull violently enough to disrupt ammunition loading operations inside the vehicle. Yet the artillery barrage itself was not the true objective. Romulus realized this when external Auspex systems began detecting enormous movement signatures advancing through the ash storms immediately behind the bombardment curtain. The Snakebites were positioning for their first major assault wave, and the environmental advantages that had favored the Imperial defenders during preparation now began transforming into confined killing grounds where neither side could easily withdraw once the fighting truly began. The first confirmed visual contact with the primary Snakebites assault wave occurred approximately 43 minutes after the opening artillery bombardment ended. Commander Eulo Romulus observed the movement through magnocular optics mounted within the Baneblade's forward command station, while ash clouds still drifted heavily across the outer approaches. At first, the enemy appeared fragmented beneath the storm cover. Isolated silhouettes emerged between refinery wreckage and collapsed transport rails, before disappearing again into the haze. Then the scale of the movement became apparent. The entire southern plain was advancing. Vox operators along the wall sectors immediately began transmitting overlapping range estimates, while searchlights swept outward through the dust fields. Hundreds of moving figures reflected intermittently beneath the beams, before vanishing again behind drifting smoke and airborne ash. Seconds later, more shapes emerged behind them. Then hundreds more. Romulus later stated during debriefing that the most unsettling aspect of the Orc advance was not their speed or size. It was their momentum. The Snakebites moved with absolute commitment toward the walls, regardless of casualties, terrain conditions, or incoming fire. There was no visible hesitation within the formation, no attempt at concealment once the attack fully began. Only continuous forward movement. The first Imperial artillery response struck the advancing horde moments later. Massive explosions erupted across the central approach corridor as pre-registered basilisk batteries opened fire from deeper hive positions behind the walls. Entire sections of the ash plain vanished beneath towering fireballs and shockwaves. Through the smoke, Romulus observed Orc bodies thrown violently into the air, alongside shattered debris and burning scrap vehicles. Yet the horde continued advancing. The Snakebites themselves differed considerably from the standardized Orc profiles contained within Imperial tactical manuals. Many wore primitive armor, assembled from scavenged metal plating, animal hides, chain bindings, and ritualistic trophies, rather than the heavier industrial scrap favored by more mechanized clans. Bones hung from belts and shoulder guards. Several carried crude glyph markings painted across exposed skin using what appeared to be blood mixed with industrial pigments. Physically, most stood substantially larger than ordinary humans, even without armor. Romulus estimated average heights ranging between 2 and 2.5 meters among frontline infantry. Larger specimens appeared, scattered throughout the formations, carrying oversized melee weapons and heavy projectile launchers constructed from crude welded components. Their skin coloration varied between dark green and nearly gray, depending upon environmental contamination and age. Numerous individuals displayed extensive scarring, suggesting frequent ritual combat within their own clan structures. tusks protruded prominently from lower jaws, while smaller red eyes remained fixed toward the hive walls with predatory intensity. The sheer noise of the advance overwhelmed portions of the defense network, even before direct engagement range was established. War drums thundered continuously from somewhere deep within the Orc formations. Massive horn instruments emitted irregular blasts across the battlefield, while thousands of guttural voices roared together beneath the ash storms. Primitive beast creatures accompanied portions of the advance, producing additional animalistic screaming that echoed against the outer hive walls. Inside the Invictus Ferrum, Jord Geffer calmly finalized targeting solutions for the Baneblade's primary cannon, while Malcolm Trias secured ammunition restraints throughout the loading compartments. The crew had transitioned fully into combat procedure by that stage. Conversation became minimal. Every member focused exclusively upon assigned operational responsibilities. Bron Guile transmitted range updates continuously through the internal Vox network. Enemy infantry entering artillery saturation zone. Western approach density increasing. Movement signatures detected within eastern drainage routes. Romulus acknowledged each update while monitoring the central corridor through the forward optics. Then the first wall turrets opened fire. Twin-linked autocannons mounted above the breach corridor erupted simultaneously, unleashing streams of tracer fire into the advancing Orc formations. Heavy bolter nests joined moments later. Red lasfire beams descended from elevated infantry lines across the walls, while mortar shells detonated throughout the ash plains. The battlefield transformed instantly. Thousands of impacts illuminated the darkness around the hive perimeter. Orc bodies exploded beneath concentrated fire. Entire sections of the advancing horde collapsed as artillery rounds tore through packed infantry clusters. Burning wreckage scattered across the plain, while surviving Orcs climbed directly over their dead without slowing. The defensive firepower should have shattered ordinary infantry assaults. The Snakebites simply absorbed it. Romulus watched through magnocular enhancement as wounded Orcs continued advancing despite catastrophic injuries that would incapacitate human soldiers immediately. Several creatures remained mobile even after losing limbs beneath artillery blasts. Others continued dragging themselves forward through burning debris fields while screaming toward the walls. Their behavior resembled predatory animals more than organized military forces. Then the first Orc return fire began striking the hive defenses. Crude artillery rockets streaked upward from the advancing formations, leaving unstable smoke trails behind them before detonating across the upper wall sectors. Most lacked precision targeting, but the sheer volume compensated for inaccuracy. Explosions erupted among guardsmen, firing positions, while fragments of ferrocrete and burning metal rained downward into the trench networks below. Romulus observed one elevated heavy bolter nest disappear entirely beneath a direct impact. The platform collapsed outward from the wall moments later, carrying surviving defenders into the darkness below. The Orc infantry continued closing distance rapidly. At approximately 800 meters from the breach corridor, Romulus finally issued firing authorization for the Invictus Ferrum. Jord Geffer responded instantly. The Baneblade's primary cannon discharged with a violent internal concussion that shook the entire vehicle from front to rear. Several nearby guardsmen reportedly stumbled from the blast pressure alone, despite wearing protective gear. The shell impacted directly within the densest central orc formation. A massive fireball erupted across the battlefield, followed by expanding debris clouds filled with shattered bodies, burning scrap metal, and pulverized ash. Entire sections of the advancing horde vanished beneath the explosion. Yet even this failed to halt the assault momentum. More orcs surged forward through the impact crater itself moments later. James Geffer and Loyd Floss immediately joined the engagement through the Baneblade's secondary weapon systems. Heavy bolters thundered from the hull sponsons, while the dorsal weapons swept continuously across advancing infantry concentrations. Shell casings flooded the internal collection trays as ammunition expenditure climbed rapidly. Inside the Baneblade, temperatures rose sharply within minutes. The smell of propellant fumes and overheated machinery filled the crew compartments, while the hull vibrated constantly from recoil impacts and nearby artillery detonations. Malcolm Trias and Jord worked continuously loading fresh shells into the primary cannon assembly with mechanical precision, despite worsening environmental conditions inside the vehicle. Outside, the first orc assault elements finally reached the outer barricade zones. Imperial minefields detonated immediately. Massive explosions tore through the advancing infantry waves, throwing bodies and debris high into the air across the breach approaches. Razor wire barriers vanished beneath the sheer weight of charging orc bodies. Secondary trench positions opened fire at nearly point-blank range, while flamers engulfed surviving attackers climbing through the obstacles. Still, they kept advancing. Romulus began observing larger enemy forms emerging behind the frontline infantry during this phase of the assault. Massive orc leaders towered above surrounding troops, carrying oversized cleavers, powered hammers, and crude banners assembled from bone and torn Imperial insignias. Several rode enormous reptilian beast creatures heavily armored with scavenged plating and iron chains. One such mounted orc survived direct heavy bolter impacts long enough to reach the outer trench lines, before Imperial Lascanon fire finally destroyed both rider and beast beneath the walls. The violence escalated continuously. Within less than 30 minutes, portions of the battlefield directly before the breach became almost impossible to distinguish beneath overlapping explosions, burning wreckage, drifting smoke, and mass infantry movement. Corpses accumulated rapidly across the approach corridor. Orc bodies piled against barricades, while guardsmen casualties littered shattered trench systems along the lower wall foundations. Then the first Snakebites reached the Baneblade itself. A cluster of surviving orcs emerged through smoke near the eastern barricades and charged directly toward the Invictus Ferrum, carrying axes, explosive charges, and improvised climbing hooks. Secondary weapon systems cut down several immediately, but others continued advancing beneath the firing arcs. Romulus watched through the side optics as one massive orc slammed directly against the Baneblade's hull, before attempting to climb upward using external armor plating as handholds. James Geffer responded by opening an emergency hatch and firing a las pistol directly into the creature's face from less than 2 meters away. The orc fell backward beneath the tracks, moments before another artillery impact detonated nearby. Inside the Baneblade, warning alarms suddenly activated across several systems simultaneously. Enemy infantry had reached the breach corridor in force, and the real battle was only beginning. By the 6th hour of continuous engagement, The battlefield surrounding the damaged gate no longer resembled a defensive line. Commander Eulo Romulus later described the area as an industrial execution ground buried beneath smoke, shattered armor plating, and biological remains from both sides of the conflict. The original trench formations before the breach had almost entirely disappeared beneath accumulated debris and repeated artillery impacts. Sections of ferrocrete roadway had collapsed inward from sustained bombardment, creating burning craters filled with wreckage and corpses. The Snakebites continued assaulting the gate without interruption. Every time one wave collapsed beneath concentrated fire, another emerged from the ash storms beyond the perimeter. Imperial artillery still functioned across deeper Hive positions, but ammunition expenditure had reached unsustainable levels. Bombardment intervals grew noticeably slower as reserve shells diminished. Several wall turrets overlooking the breach corridor had already fallen silent entirely due to overheating, ammunition depletion, or direct destruction from Orc artillery strikes. The Invictus Ferrum remained operational at the center of the defense, though the Baneblade had suffered substantial punishment. The exterior hull showed hundreds of visible impact scars from heavy caliber rounds, crude explosives, and melee strikes from Orc boarding attempts. Several secondary armor plates along the port side had partially detached beneath repeated detonations. Smoke leaked intermittently from damaged ventilation systems near the rear engine housing, despite Scylla's continuous repair efforts. Internally, conditions had deteriorated severely. Temperatures inside the Baneblade reached dangerous levels due to sustained weapon discharge and failing coolant circulation systems. The crew operated in near constant heat, while surrounded by ammunition racks vibrating beneath continuous recoil impacts. Condensation mixed with oil runoff dripped from interior plating onto the compartment floors. Smoke contamination from partially damaged ventilation filters made breathing increasingly difficult without respirator assistance. Still, the crew maintained operational rhythm. Jord Geffer and Malcolm Trias continued primary cannon loading procedures, despite visible exhaustion. By Romulus's later estimate, the pair had manually assisted in cycling hundreds of heavy shells throughout the engagement. Both men displayed burns along their forearms from overheated loading mechanisms, while sweat and soot covered nearly every exposed section of skin. James Geffer's condition worsened steadily during the middle stages of the defense. Approximately 4 hours into the assault, an Orc explosive detonated directly against the starboard sponson during a boarding attempt. Although the armor prevented full penetration, the internal concussion injured James severely while he operated the heavy bolter systems. Blood reportedly poured from his right ear immediately afterward, indicating possible internal trauma. His vision became partially impaired, yet he refused medical extraction and continued firing almost continuously through the remainder of the engagement. Loyd Floss suffered burns across the left side of his neck and shoulder when an ammunition feed motor overloaded beside the dorsal weapon station. The injury blackened portions of his flak armor and damaged several purity seals lining the compartment walls. Even after emergency treatment from field medical personnel stationed outside the vehicle, Floss resumed operation within minutes. No member of the crew considered withdrawal acceptable at that stage. Beyond the Baneblade itself, casualties among the supporting guardsmen had become catastrophic. Entire trench sectors before the breach were now silent, except for scattered survivors, fighting from collapsed barricades and shell holes. The 72nd Belis Line, regiment stationed directly above the gate, reportedly lost nearly half its operational strength within the first several hours of contact. Medical evacuation routes toward the interior Hive sectors became increasingly congested as wounded personnel overwhelmed transport corridors beneath the walls. Romulus observed the effects constantly through the command optics. Bodies lined nearly every visible section of the defensive approaches. Burned guardsmen remained slumped beside heavy bolter nests, still smoking from recent use. Medicaid teams dragged wounded soldiers toward the interior under incoming artillery fire, while replacement infantry formations rushed forward carrying fresh ammunition crates and demolition charges. Yet, despite the losses, the objective itself remained technically secured. The Snakebites still had not breached the gate corridor in sufficient numbers to penetrate the Hive interior. This fact became the sole operational measurement that mattered. Bron Guile maintained continuous assessment reports throughout the fighting, despite worsening communication failures across the sector. Vox traffic had devolved into fragmented screams, artillery requests, casualty reports, and repeated emergency signals from collapsing wall positions. Entire frequencies disappeared without explanation as command bunkers or relay stations were destroyed. Guile, nonetheless, continued organizing what information remained usable. Eastern wall sections holding. Western trench line lost. Inner reserve formations mobilizing. Turret ammunition critically low. The tactical officer's voice remained calm, even while the Baneblade shook violently beneath another nearby artillery impact. Romulus later admitted that Guile's composure prevented operational collapse inside the vehicle more than once. The Orc boarding attempts intensified dramatically during the later stages of the defense. By then, large numbers of Snakebites had reached the hull of the Invictus Ferrum repeatedly through sheer numerical pressure, despite the surrounding defensive fire. Some carried magnetic climbing hooks attached to chains, while others attempted to wedge explosives directly into vulnerable sections of the armor plating. The Baneblade effectively became a battlefield unto itself. James Geffer and Loyd Floss spent extended periods firing las weapons and sidearms through emergency access hatches at Orcs, physically climbing across the vehicle exterior. Guardsmen positioned atop the walls above the breach assisted whenever possible, shooting downward into enemy clusters attempting to board the super-heavy tank. Romulus personally killed at least 3 Snakebites during one breach attempt, after a group of Orcs reached the upper hull near the command cupola. He later described seeing one creature attempting to force open an external maintenance hatch using a crude iron axe, while lasfire and heavy bolter rounds tore through the surrounding battlefield. The commander executed the Orc with a bolt pistol from less than 2 meters away. Its body remained hanging partially across the hull afterward, because no one possessed time to remove it. Scylla, meanwhile, worked under increasingly dangerous conditions throughout the engagement. Multiple sections of the Baneblade's internal systems began failing simultaneously as the machine absorbed prolonged punishment beyond standard operational tolerances. Cooling systems degraded steadily. Ammunition feed motors overheated repeatedly. Several targeting relays malfunctioned due to shock damage from nearby explosions. The Adeptus Mechanicus representative moved continuously between compartments surrounded by servo limbs, sparks, sacred oils, and repair tools, while chanting binary machine prayers through damaged vocal implants. At one stage, she informed Romulus that the Invictus Ferrum's engine core temperature had entered unstable thresholds. The Baneblade was beginning to die. Fuel reserves also approached critical depletion. The super-heavy engine consumed enormous quantities of promethium, even during static combat operations, due to continuous turret rotation, recoil stabilization, power distribution, and environmental filtration demands. Initial projections had assumed periodic resupply intervals from rear logistical convoys. Those convoys never arrived. Orc assaults across the outer transit roads had severed most supply routes leading toward the Gate District. The Invictus Ferrum now operated almost entirely upon remaining internal reserves. Ammunition shortages soon followed. Jord Geffer reported fewer than 20 primary cannon shells remaining approximately 7 hours into the engagement. Heavy bolter ammunition also declined rapidly due to the intensity of close-range fighting around the hull. Guardsmen from nearby wall sectors attempted emergency ammunition transfers under fire, but casualty rates among runners became severe. Romulus recognized the implications immediately. The Baneblade could not survive indefinite combat at current operational tempo. Yet abandoning the breach prematurely would guarantee collapse of the outer defense corridor. The commander therefore ordered strict fire discipline across all remaining weapon systems. Primary cannon rounds would now target only dense assault concentrations or large enemy command elements. Secondary weapons shifted toward controlled bursts instead of continuous suppression fire. Every shell suddenly mattered. Outside the walls, the Snakebites began dragging larger siege engines toward the breach, approaches beneath cover of smoke and mass infantry assaults. Crude armored towers assembled from scrap metal and chained plating advanced slowly through the corpse fields, while massive beast creatures hauled artillery platforms closer toward effective range. The next assault wave would likely reach the walls in overwhelming numbers. Romulus understood this before anyone needed to state it aloud. Still, the gate remained closed. The Hive interior still stood protected behind the Invictus Ferrum, and the exhausted defenders surrounding it. For the crew inside the Baneblade, that alone justified continuing the fight. Because by that stage of the siege, survival had already ceased being the mission objective. The execution of the primary mission objective began during the 9th hour of continuous engagement, when Strategic Command officially transmitted confirmation that evacuation corridors within the second Hive sectors had reached operational readiness. Commander Eulo Romulus received the message through a heavily distorted Vox channel, while the Invictus Ferrum continued firing into advancing Snakebites assault formations only meters beyond the breach corridor. The order itself was brief. Hold the gate for as long as physically possible. Delay enemy penetration until final withdrawal authorization. Nothing further accompanied the transmission. No reinforcement estimates. No extraction guarantees. No mention of survival probabilities for the remaining defenders outside the inner Hive walls. Romulus understood immediately that the outer gate district had effectively been sacrificed. The Baneblade crew nevertheless continued operating without objection. By then, the battlefield surrounding the breach had transformed into an almost continuous wall of violence. Smoke from burning wreckage and artillery detonations reduced visibility to less than 50 meters around portions of the corridor. Searchlights mounted above the walls flickered intermittently through drifting ash clouds, while damaged turrets continued firing in uncontrolled bursts from overheating weapon systems. The ground before the Invictus Ferrum no longer existed as recognizable terrain. Instead, the approach corridor had become a layered mass of corpses, shattered barricades, destroyed orc vehicles, burning ammunition crates, and cratered ferrocrete soaked in fuel and blood. Imperial bodies and orc remains lay mixed together beneath the advancing horde. Some sections of the battlefield physically rose several feet above the original roadway due to accumulated dead. Yet the Snakebites still advanced. The Baneblade's primary cannon fired again, illuminating the breach corridor with another massive explosion that temporarily scattered the nearest orc assault wave. Jord Geffer immediately began recalibrating the damaged targeting systems, while Malcolm Trias struggled to maneuver another shell into loading position. Romulus watched both men carefully through the command compartment reflections. They were nearing physical collapse. Malcolm's movements had slowed significantly from exhaustion and accumulated injuries. Blood-stained portions of his sleeves from cuts sustained during ammunition handling procedures, while repeated recoil concussions visibly affected his balance. Jord's right arm trembled continuously between firing sequences due to muscle fatigue and internal bruising. Neither requested relief. No relief remained available. Across the upper wall sectors, surviving guardsmen maintained defensive fire with similarly deteriorating efficiency. Many heavy weapon teams now operated at partial strength after losing loaders or ammunition carriers during earlier assaults. Several firing positions had resorted to scavenging ammunition directly from dead personnel scattered along the battlements. Still, the defenders continued fighting because withdrawal had not yet been authorized. Bron Guile eventually relayed the latest tactical estimate from surviving command channels. Inner evacuation routes nearing completion. Outer civilian districts abandoned. Secondary hive barricades now sealed. The tactical officer paused briefly while listening to additional fragmented transmissions through the Vox receiver. Estimated final hold duration: less than 1 hour. Romulus acknowledged quietly. The mission objective had narrowed into pure delay. Nothing more remained to accomplish outside buying additional time for the hive interior. The Snakebites launched their largest coordinated assault shortly afterward. Orc artillery intensified across the entire southern wall sector moments before the main infantry advance began. Massive explosive impacts hammered the battlements continuously, while crude rockets screamed overhead into the hive structures beyond. Several wall sections near the eastern flank collapsed entirely beneath sustained bombardment, burying guardsmen firing positions beneath tons of ferrocrete debris. Then the horde surged forward. Thousands of orcs advanced simultaneously across the breach. Approaches supported by massive scrap armored vehicles and towering siege platforms dragged through the corpse fields by chained beast creatures. War drums thundered across the battlefield, loud enough to vibrate the Baneblade's internal hull plating, while enormous orc banners rose through the smoke behind the advancing formations. The defenders unleashed everything remaining. Wall turrets fired continuously until several weapon barrels physically ruptured from overheating. artillery batteries emptied reserve ammunition stocks into the advancing horde, regardless of range safety margins. Guardsmen atop the battlements fired laser guns at nearly point-blank distances into orc masses already reaching the lower barricades. The Invictus Ferrum became the center of the entire defense line. Its primary cannon obliterated advancing siege towers, while secondary heavy bolters swept through dense infantry concentrations, pressing toward the breach. Shell impacts detonated across the corridor without pause. Entire orc formations disappeared beneath overlapping explosions, only for new attackers to climb directly through the fire and debris moments later. Then the first major breach occurred. A massive orc siege vehicle smashed through the remaining eastern barricades beneath concentrated artillery cover, while hundreds of Snakebites surged behind it into the lower gate corridor. Imperial trench lines collapsed almost immediately under the assault. Surviving guardsmen fell back toward the Baneblade, while firing continuously into the advancing horde. Romulus observed orc infantry physically climbing over burning wreckage and dead bodies to reach the hull of the Invictus Ferrum. The super-heavy tank disappeared beneath enemy contact alarms. Impacts thundered across the armor plating as explosives detonated along the tracks and secondary weapon housings. James Geffer and Loyd Floss fired desperately through emergency firing ports at orcs scaling the hull, while guardsmen above the walls attempted to clear boarding groups from elevated positions. Inside the Baneblade, warning systems activated across nearly every operational display simultaneously. Track integrity compromised. Cooling systems failing. Engine pressure critical. Secondary ammunition feeds damaged. Scylla moved through the smoke-filled interior like a mechanical spectre surrounded by sparks and servo arms, while attempting emergency stabilization procedures across collapsing systems. Her damaged vocal implants emitted distorted binary prayers almost continuously beneath the roar of combat. Then the primary cannon malfunctioned. A violent metallic shriek echoed through the hull during loading operations, before the entire turret assembly locked partially sideways. Malcolm Trias was thrown backward against an ammunition rack hard enough to crack his ribs, while warning lights flooded the compartment. Jord Geffer immediately attempted manual override procedures. No response. The Invictus Ferrum had lost its main weapon. Romulus later admitted that this moment represented the first time he genuinely believed the defense had failed. Yet the mission objective still remained incomplete. Guile suddenly received final confirmation from command through the Vox network. The inner Hive evacuation routes had been sealed. Civilian withdrawal operations were complete. The defenders outside the second wall no longer needed to hold indefinitely. Withdrawal authorization had finally been granted. Romulus immediately assessed the surrounding battlefield through the command optics. The situation had already deteriorated beyond organized retreat conditions. Large portions of the breach corridor now swarmed with Snakebites infantry. Several wall sections above the gate burned uncontrollably, while orc artillery continued striking deeper into the defensive positions. The Baneblade itself remained partially immobilized after sustaining repeated track impacts and engine damage. The Invictus Ferrum would never reach the inner Hive alive. Romulus understood this instantly. He also understood something else. The Baneblade still contained enough fuel and ammunition reserves to produce catastrophic detonation if deliberately overloaded. The commander turned toward Bron Guile, inside the smoke-filled command compartment. No lengthy discussion followed. No argument occurred among the crew. Every member already recognized the same conclusion. The Invictus Ferrum had fulfilled its purpose. Now it would perform one final function. Romulus ordered Scylla to begin preparing the engine core and remaining ammunition stores for controlled overload detonation, while the surviving crew maintained defensive fire around the hull. The Baneblade would become the last barricade sealing the breach, even if it destroyed itself in the process. The preparation for evacuation began while the battle still raged directly outside the hull of the Invictus Ferrum. Commander Eulo Romulus intentionally delayed the withdrawal sequence until the final possible moment in order to maximize the destructive radius of the planned detonation. Every additional second, the Baneblade remained operational, forced more Snakebites infantry into the breach corridor surrounding the vehicle. The decision carried enormous risk. If the crew waited too long, they would never escape the blast radius before overload occurred. Inside the Baneblade, conditions had deteriorated into near total mechanical collapse. Smoke filled multiple internal compartments despite emergency filtration procedures. Lighting systems flickered inconsistently from damaged power relays, while warning sirens continued echoing through the hull beneath the roar of combat outside. Scylla completed the detonation preparations within the central engine compartment, surrounded by overheating machinery and leaking coolant vapor. The Adeptus Mechanicus representative had bypassed multiple reactor safeguards, manually using servo appendages connected directly into the Baneblade's machine core. Remaining ammunition reserves were linked into the overload sequence to maximize secondary explosions following ignition. The resulting blast would annihilate the Invictus Ferrum completely, possibly sections of the breach corridor as well. Bron Guile calculated approximately 7 minutes before catastrophic detonation thresholds would become irreversible. That was all the time the crew possessed to escape the outer gate district. Romulus ordered immediate evacuation. The first challenge emerged the moment the side hatch mechanisms attempted to open. External pressure from Orc bodies piled against the hull partially jammed the emergency release systems. James Geffer and Davon Fritz physically forced the hatch outward, while gunfire and smoke flooded into the compartment. The noise from outside became overwhelming instantly. Heavy bolter fire thundered overhead from surviving wall positions, while Orc screams echoed across the breach corridor, only meters away. The battlefield outside the Baneblade had transformed into complete chaos. Fires burned across nearly every visible structure surrounding the gate. Sections of the outer wall continued collapsing from artillery impacts, while wrecked Orc siege machines smoldered beside shattered barricades and burning trench systems. The ground itself had become difficult to traverse due to corpses, rubble, shell craters, and destroyed equipment covering nearly every section of the corridor. Worse still, large numbers of Snakebites infantry already occupied portions of the lower defense lines. The crew exited into an active war zone, with almost no organized Imperial perimeter remaining around them. Romulus emerged first, carrying a bolt pistol and command saber, while immediately directing the crew toward the eastern maintenance corridor, leading deeper into the Hive approaches. The route had originally served as an emergency engineering access tunnel beneath the wall foundations. Tactical Command believed portions of the corridor remained operational, despite heavy damage sustained during the siege. Whether the route still remained open was uncertain. James Geffer exited next, alongside Loyd Floss, while continuing suppressive fire toward Orc infantry, moving between the wreckage surrounding the Baneblade. Both men carried compact las weapons scavenged from dead guardsmen earlier during the fighting. Ammunition remained critically limited. Most surviving defenders had already exhausted standard reserve magazines hours earlier. Malcolm Trias required assistance leaving the vehicle. The loader's condition had worsened substantially during the final combat stages inside the Baneblade. Cracked ribs and prolonged physical strain left him barely capable of stable movement. Davon Fritz and Jord Geffer supported him between them while navigating downward from the damaged hull into the burning corridor below. Scylla exited last. Before departing, the Adeptus Mechanicus representative reportedly placed one metallic hand against the interior hull beside the engine compartment, while reciting fragmented machine prayers through damaged vocal systems. Romulus later admitted he did not fully understand the ritual, though he recognized its significance. The Baneblade's machine spirit was being abandoned. Outside the vehicle, visibility remained dangerously poor due to smoke and ash contamination. Emergency sirens echoed throughout the outer gate district, while artillery impacts continued striking nearby sectors. Surviving guardsmen fought scattered defensive actions among collapsed barricades and burning bunkers without coherent front lines remaining. The crew began moving immediately. Time had become the primary threat. Bron Guile estimated less than 6 minutes before the overload sequence reached detonation conditions. The eastern maintenance corridor entrance lay approximately 300 meters from the Baneblade's final position. Under ordinary circumstances, the distance would require less than 2 minutes to cross. During the siege evacuation, it became an exhausting combat withdrawal through collapsing defensive terrain under continuous enemy pressure. The first Orc contact occurred almost instantly. A cluster of Snakebites emerged through smoke near a destroyed trench line barely 20 meters ahead of the crew, while dragging wounded Imperial soldiers from the rubble. One of the creatures spotted the escaping tank crew immediately and roared toward nearby infantry formations. James Geffer opened fire first. Last bolts struck the lead Orc repeatedly across the chest and neck before Loyd Floss finished it with concentrated bursts from a scavenged auto-pistol. The remaining Snakebites charged directly toward the crew moments later. Romulus personally killed another Orc with his bolt pistol at near point-blank range, while Jord Geffer smashed the butt of his las rifle into a charging attacker attempting to reach Malcolm Trias. The engagement lasted only seconds, but the delay already consumed valuable time. More enemy movement appeared through the smoke afterward. The Snakebites had begun noticing the evacuation. The crew resumed movement through the shattered corridor, while artillery continued detonating across the surrounding defenses. Several surviving guardsmen joined the retreat route intermittently, falling back toward the maintenance tunnels, carrying wounded personnel or depleted ammunition crates. Most looked physically exhausted beyond normal combat fatigue. Blood, soot, and ash covered nearly every uniform visible throughout the withdrawal. Davon Fritz repeatedly checked over his shoulder toward the Invictus Ferrum during movement pauses. The Baneblade still fired intermittently, despite abandonment. Delayed ammunition, cook-offs, and secondary system discharges caused random weapon detonations from the crippled hull, creating the illusion that the super heavy tank remained partially operational. Several nearby Orc groups continued assaulting the vehicle, unaware of the imminent overload buried inside the engine core. Romulus recognized the tactical advantage immediately. The enemy still considered the Baneblade an active threat. That misconception bought the crew additional escape time. The maintenance corridor entrance finally became visible through the smoke approximately 4 minutes into the withdrawal. The reinforced blast tunnel descended beneath the eastern wall sectors through partially collapsed ferrocrete access ramps lined with damaged hazard lights and emergency barricades. Unfortunately, the entrance had not remained uncontested. A large group of surviving guardsmen already crowded the tunnel approach, attempting to organize evacuation procedures, while under continuous Orc pursuit from the outer trench sectors. Medici personnel dragged wounded soldiers downward into the corridor, while heavy weapon teams attempted rearguard suppression fire from collapsed barricades above the entrance. Panic had begun spreading through portions of the retreating defenders. Romulus forced his way through the congestion, while identifying himself to the evacuation personnel coordinating tunnel access. The commander immediately ordered remaining soldiers away from the upper entrance ramps. No one initially understood why. Then Bron Guile announced the remaining detonation time allowed. Less than 2 minutes. The realization spread instantly across the withdrawal route. Imperial personnel began descending deeper into the tunnel systems with renewed urgency, while scattered guardsmen still above ground attempted final suppression fire against approaching Snakebites forces now flooding through the breach corridor in overwhelming numbers. Romulus stopped briefly near the tunnel entrance and looked back toward the battlefield one final time. The Invictus Ferrum still stood within the center of the ruined gate, surrounded by smoke, fire, corpses, and advancing Orc infantry, climbing directly across its damaged hull. The Baneblade appeared less like a vehicle now, and more like a dying fortress refusing to collapse. Then warning sirens from deeper within the hull suddenly intensified. The overload sequence had entered terminal ignition phase. Romulus ordered the remaining crew into the tunnel immediately, and the escape from the outer gate became a race against the destruction of the machine that had kept the Hive alive long enough to survive. The detonation occurred 34 seconds after Commander Eulo Romulus and the surviving crew descended beyond the primary blast doors of the eastern maintenance corridor. Even beneath several layers of reinforced ferrocrete and armored tunnel plating, the explosion struck with enough force to throw personnel from their feet throughout the evacuation route. The shockwave traveled through the underground corridors like a physical wall of pressure, accompanied by a deafening metallic roar that drowned out every other sound momentarily. Emergency lighting across the tunnel systems failed immediately afterward. Dust and debris poured from the ceilings, while secondary tremors rippled through the surrounding structure. Several wounded guardsmen, already weakened from earlier combat, were reportedly killed when portions of the corridor partially collapsed farther behind the retreating defenders. For several seconds, nobody inside the tunnel understood the scale of what had happened. Then the heat arrived. A wave of superheated air surged downward through the maintenance passages, carrying smoke, ash, vaporized fuel residue, and the distant echo of collapsing structures from the outer gate district. Emergency bulkheads deeper within the tunnel sealed automatically to prevent fire spread toward the inner hive sectors. The Invictus Ferrum had ceased to exist. Commander Romulus regained his footing slowly beside the tunnel wall, while debris continued raining across the corridor floor. Around him, exhausted guardsmen attempted to reorganize evacuation lines amid flickering emergency lights and overloaded Vox traffic. Bron Guile was the first member of the crew to speak. The breach corridor is gone. His assessment proved accurate. Fragmented tactical reports began arriving through surviving command frequencies minutes later. The Baneblade's overloaded engine core and ammunition reserves had produced a detonation significantly larger than Strategic Command originally predicted. The explosion annihilated much of the immediate gate approach, including surviving Orc siege towers clustered around the vehicle during the final assault stages. Entire sections of the damaged breach collapsed inward beneath the blast. Thousands of Snakebites infantry occupying the corridor vanished instantly beneath fire, pressure, and falling debris. Secondary detonations from nearby ammunition stockpiles and damaged artillery positions expanded the destruction further across the outer wall sectors. Most importantly, the advancing Orc assault momentum had been interrupted. The Horde no longer possessed immediate access into the Hive interior. The sacrifice of the Invictus Ferrum had bought the defenders additional time. That had been the mission objective from the beginning. The surviving crew continued moving deeper into the Hive through evacuation corridors crowded with wounded personnel, reserve infantry formations, engineering crews, and displaced civilians redirected from the outer districts. Conditions inside the lower Hive tunnels reflected the scale of the broader siege unfolding across Belis Corona. Thousands of refugees filled the transit passages. Workers from abandoned manufactorums carried whatever possessions they could salvage, while Arbeits personnel attempted maintaining movement discipline along the overcrowded routes. Medical stations overflowed with wounded guardsmen suffering burns, amputations, shrapnel injuries, and severe trauma sustained during the outer wall defense. The smell inside the tunnels became overwhelming. Blood, industrial chemicals, smoke contamination, human overcrowding. Recirculated air systems struggled against the sheer population density now flooding the lower transit sectors. Romulus and his crew moved largely in silence during the withdrawal toward the secondary command districts. Exhaustion had reduced most conversation to brief operational exchanges. Several crew members displayed clear signs of physical collapse by this stage. James Geffer could barely maintain stable balance due to internal injuries sustained during the sponson explosion earlier in the battle. Blood continued leaking intermittently from his damaged ear, while his hearing had degraded almost completely on one side. Malcolm Trias required assistance walking after the prolonged combat strain inside the Baneblade compounded existing fractures and muscle trauma. Loyd Floss suffered worsening burns across his neck and shoulder, despite emergency treatment, while Jord Geffer displayed severe bruising along both arms from repeated loading impacts during the engagement. Even Davon Fritz, physically one of the strongest members of the crew, moved with visible stiffness caused by prolonged exposure to recoil shock and combat fatigue. Scylla alone appeared largely unaffected physically. The Adeptus Mechanicus representative walked steadily through the overcrowded tunnels surrounded by servo appendages, blackened with soot and oil residue. Yet Romulus later observed something unusual about her behavior following the destruction of the Invictus Ferrum. She no longer spoke to the crew unless absolutely necessary. Whether this reflected grief toward the loss of the Baneblade's machine spirit or simple operational detachment remained unclear. The surviving crew finally reached the secondary command district approximately 2 hours after the destruction of the outer gate. The area had been established within an underground logistics station beneath the second Hive wall, where reserve commanders coordinated evacuation routes, artillery redeployment, and reinforcement movements toward remaining defensive sectors. The atmosphere inside the command center resembled controlled collapse. Vox operators shouted overlapping casualty reports across crowded tactical stations, while exhausted officers attempted reorganizing shattered regimental structures from incomplete battlefield data. Hololithic displays showed large portions of the southern outer districts already consumed by Orc occupation. Yet the Hive still stood. That fact alone represented victory under the circumstances. Romulus and the surviving crew were directed toward immediate medical evaluation before formal debriefing procedures began. Medicae personnel documented extensive injuries across nearly every member of the team. Temporary hearing loss, internal bruising, dehydration, smoke inhalation, burns, and exhaustion appeared consistently throughout the crew assessments. Malcolm Trias required extended stabilization treatment due to cracked ribs and muscular damage severe enough to impair breathing. James Geffer's internal ear trauma was classified as potentially permanent. Romulus himself displayed multiple untreated cuts, alongside significant blast pressure injuries sustained during the final withdrawal. Still, none of the crew required immediate surgical intervention. Compared to most survivors arriving from the outer wall sectors, they were considered fortunate. The formal debriefing occurred approximately 7 hours after the Baneblade's destruction. Commander Romulus, Bron Guile, and Scylla attended the primary session, while the remaining crew recovered within medical holding areas nearby. The interrogation chamber itself consisted of a reinforced tactical briefing room beneath the secondary command station, lit by dim lumen strips and malfunctioning tactical displays, still tracking ongoing battles throughout the Hive outskirts. Senior officers from the Belis Defense Command conducted the questioning. The tone remained professional throughout. No ceremonial praise accompanied the proceedings. No dramatic recognition of sacrifice occurred. The Hive remained under active siege conditions, and thousands of personnel continued dying across multiple defensive sectors every hour. Operational necessity outweighed sentiment. Romulus delivered his report calmly. He described the deterioration of the gate defenses, the progression of Orc assault formations, ammunition depletion rates, wall collapse timings, casualties among the supporting infantry regiments, and the final detonation sequence executed within the Invictus Ferrum. Bron Guile supplemented the report with tactical estimates regarding enemy numbers and battlefield effectiveness. Scylla contributed technical assessments concerning the Baneblade's operational lifespan under sustained siege conditions, before finally confirming total destruction of the machine spirit following overload ignition. One particular moment from the debriefing remained preserved within later archive transcripts. A senior command officer eventually asked Romulus whether the Baneblade could have been withdrawn earlier before catastrophic damage rendered escape impossible. The commander reportedly paused several seconds before answering. Yes. The officer then asked why the vehicle remained at the breach. Romulus looked toward the damaged tactical display, showing evacuation routes deeper inside Hive Belis Corona, before giving his response. Because the gate was still open. No further clarification was requested afterward. The surviving crew of the Invictus Ferrum received reassignment orders 3 days later, following partial medical recovery. Replacement armored assets no longer existed in sufficient numbers to maintain full Baneblade operations within the Belis Defense Forces. Instead, surviving personnel were redistributed toward secondary defensive units throughout the Hive interior. The war for Belis Corona continued for another 11 standard weeks before Imperial reinforcement fleets finally reached orbit above Karthax Tertius. By then, entire districts of the Hive had already been destroyed. Yet the inner sectors survived. Civilian evacuation routes remained functional long enough to preserve millions of lives behind the second wall defenses. Strategic analysis later concluded that the destruction of the Invictus Ferrum at the outer gate significantly delayed the Snakebites' breakthrough during the most critical phase of the siege. Commander Eulo Romulus never commanded another Baneblade after the fall of the outer gate district. According to surviving records, he visited the reconstructed southern wall sectors several years later after the siege ended. Workers had already cleared most of the battlefield debris by then. New ferrocrete fortifications covered the old breach corridor, where the Invictus Ferrum made its final stand. Nothing visible remained of the Baneblade itself. Only a scorched section of reinforced roadway buried beneath the rebuilt gate foundations marked the place where the machine had detonated. Romulus reportedly stood there in silence for several minutes before leaving the wall sectors without speaking to the accompanying officers. No monument was ever constructed for the crew. The Hive simply continued functioning, like it always had.